I go by the name. That was the Zoom talking. I go by the name of Mohaile Mogashwa. I'm a passionate historian and anthropologist. I'm a founder at an entity we call Wikipedia. It's a history and anthropology company. So I'm going to be driving the program for us tonight. So we're going to have a very simple, straightforward program. And we're going to have our Mwalimu Ayabulela Mhlatlo straight out of the US this evening. So it's going to be very interesting. I would like everyone to be part of it and participate in any other way. There will be a Q&A at the end and so forth. This is the 5th season of the Black Education Masterclass, and our theme this year is a curriculum for power, hosted by Ebukhosini Solutions. This is our 3rd episode this year. Ebukhosini Solutions is a community-based organization offering solutions related to community development, capacity building, social challenges, and cultural literacy. The company specializes in African-centered education, training, production, management, empowerment work, social entrepreneurship, cultural exchange, and events. So we're going to have only one Walimu. We remember, if you were part of these sessions in the previous years, we used to have 2 lectures in one evening, but we've moved it now to 1. And the lecture will be about 45 minutes long. And then we're going to have about, say, 30 or so minutes of questions and answers. I'm going to introduce the speaker and they're going to do the presentation. And then after that, only after that, we'll take the questions, and then our Mwalimu will be allowed to respond to those questions and comments and so forth. So this is an introductory series. So each Mwalimu, the subjects that we put on the table are large, are big in nature. So the Mwalimu has just been asked to simplify, and we'll highlight the aspects that give us a basic understanding. And then from there, we expect it to continue, our own studies. So that just means that we're going to leave tonight's session with our own homeworks and assignments. And so we're going to also be keeping time, and we're going to, the time's going to be very important. We're going to be very punctual. So our Mwalimu for the evening, Ayabulela. Ayabulela Mhlatlo is a PhD student in philosophy department at the University of Connecticut. She's a long-standing member of the Black House Collective. She works on epistemic justice and anti-hegemonic knowledge practice. She graduated with a Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy and African Literature at the University of the Witwatersrand, Johannesburg in South Africa. She's a first-class master's graduate in African Literature Department at the University of the Witwatersrand. She also recently graduated with a second Master's of Arts degree in Political Studies at the University of Cape Town. Her first MA was on the riddling metaphysics of reality in Umakhosi Vusamazulu Mutwa Credo Smiths. So what was there? Just missed something here quickly. So her second project is on mystical elements of canonical texts in Black studies. She's largely interested in Africana philosophy, decolonial theory, avant-garde and experimental philosophical or critical traditions, mysticism, imagination studies, epistemic archaeologies, and Southern African mythologies. She is the inaugural recipient of the Rhodes Must Fall Award at the University of Cape Town for her dissertational proposal. So that is her in brief. You can tell that she is a titan in her own right. And, you know, our theme this season is the curriculum for power. So she's well patched in that sphere to take us through a journey tonight. So I ask everybody to, you know, welcome Mwalimu Ayabulela Mshasho. She's going to deliver the lecture in the next moment. Just some basic house rules. We request that all attendants please have your mics and cameras off so we can give all our attentions to the Mwalimu, to Mwalimu Ayabulela. And then in 40 or so minutes time, we're going to have our questions and answers. So as she progresses with the lecture, you take your notes down, you list your comments and questions, which will take in about 40 minutes time from now. And also to yourself, Mwalimu Ayabulela, we're going to be a little punctual. So the moment you go over your allocated time, we're going to give you an indication. And then at that point, we will be expecting you to start wrapping up the lecture. And then obviously then preparing yourself to take the questions. So yes, in this moment, please join me in welcoming Mwalimu Ayabulela Mshasho, straight out of the US this evening. And yes, the floor is yours, madam.
Thank you so much for that beautiful introduction and for setting out the house rules, my brother. As he's already indicated, I am Ayabulela Mshasho, and I'm so honored to be invited by Emukosini Solutions, led by Obaba Buntu and Mamtebuho, and as well for the BEM team for their courteous treatment of me and organizing this event. I'm just deeply honored to give this class. The paper I want to present is from an unpublished paper. So unfortunately, I don't have PowerPoints because it is a rule that if a work is not published, it's best not to present it in its full scope. But I want to invite you in thinking alongside me about what I call the cosmo metaphysics of politics. As you would have noticed from the poster or the advert, today's lecture, or let's say discussion, because it's a dialogue that includes all of us, is on reality and imagination in African liberation activism. And so as our moderator noted, those two concepts, reality and imagination, are already deeply heavy concepts, you know, and each of them deserves, you know, a dissertation. So or book length project, or even canons of works dedicated just to those separate concepts. So I thought that I'd have to zone in on my lecture today, on my presentation. And I'm particularly interested in discussing the problem of reality in politics, and hence it's called the cosmo-metaphysics of politics. Now, just to break down that title a bit, and you'll see this unravel as I continue to speak. Cosmo-metaphysics, because for me, at least, I define metaphysics, so I'm along the tradition that defines metaphysics simply as the study of reality. Unlike ontologists who define metaphysics as the study of existence, I'm more interested in the problem of reality, because I'm not interested in objects, because ontology is largely interested in existences in the form of substance and objects. I'm more in the school of metaphysics that is interested in the problem of reality as phenomenon or compact phenomena and forces. So we basically study or define most things, if not everything, as a force within the larger fold of reality. And moving along that logic and that tradition, I will also think about politics as a force and not as an object. And my argument really is that the West's biggest crime against politics has been the ontologization of politics, transforming the massive force of politics into a mere object that is owned by, the few, or owned by the property owning classes. So within our era of modernity, capitalist modernity, that is, we've seen the transformation of politics from, a multifaceted and highly complex force into a mere object which can be, privately owned or privately distributed amongst, the property owning class, or those who've come to define themselves as the property owning class. So I want us to move away from that logic and that practice of politics and and logic of power from just a mere object owned by a select few, and move us also out of that game of reconstructing politics within that same logic, and think more about politics as a force that we collectively engineer. And in the same vein, as you will see, as I continue to read from my presentation, you will see that, I not only think about power as collectively engineered, I also think about reality as collectively engineered. And I've gathered those concepts specifically of reality as collectively engineered from my studies in African mythology, particularly the Sanusi Credumutua's work and Mazizi Kunene. And that will all unfold, probably not completely in this paper, but certainly, hopefully, as we continue to engage in some of the work that I do on behalf of my ancestors. So yeah, in this lecture, we will build collectively, hopefully, a metaphysical account of the force of politics. To do this, I suggest that we must disentangle our political theory from Aristotelian substance metaphysics and Hellenistic frameworks and methods of conceptualizing political phenomena. Instead, I propose that we read the problem of political force from the frameworks of temporal and multi-dimensional metaphysics. So there's different schools of metaphysics. The West, in the way that it's constructed its philosophy, has focused exclusively on Aristotelian metaphysics, which is substance metaphysics. Aristotle has an interesting cosmology or cosmological system, one that he builds himself and constructs from Greek mythology. And his idea is very simple, and we see this idea replicated in various other Western schools of metaphysics. And we also see it more importantly in the West theology and in its cosmological system. So his idea is that, there's one true substance of reality, or one true substance from which all reality emerges from, or from which all reality emanates from. And this substance sort of reproduces itself through the various objects that it produces. In Judeo-Christian mythology or cosmology, this substance is God, who is the Word. And from that emanates all other objects of reality, such as space and time, the political and social world, and various other, dimensions of that particular cosmology. So that substance is the central force of reality, and it's the engineering force of reality. I think that the problem with our political practice, even as Africans and as Pan-Africanists particularly, and as the Black radical force in this past 500 years of captivity, is that we have produced our politics from that very same cosmological, paradigm and system, operating as if there is one engineering substance of all reality, and all other objects emanate from that substance. So unknowingly or unwittingly, we have reproduced our politics, our political practice from that, and we've been caught in the constant ritual of sort of like justifying or reproducing the force of this metaphysical system. And my argument, using African cosmology as well as mythology is to move us out of that metaphysical system and operate our politics from a multidimensional and a temporally centered metaphysical framework. So that's what we're working with today. My first critique is that that modern political theory is firmly rooted in and supported by the grounds of substance metaphysics. Subsequently, I argue that theoretical Hellenism has produced the widespread and now hegemonic, in the words of Sylvia Wynter, it has produced this widespread tendency of metaphysically classing or typifying phenomena such as politics and tragedy, and thus transforming those forces into mere objects or antics that can be reduced, obviously, as we see now in our capitalist age, where politics is reduced into a mere commodity that can be traded between, a select few class of subjects. Much like Orientalism, Hellenism, which is, the study of a Greek-centered world or a world that emerges from Greek antiquity, is grounded and is a grounding and definitive part of what Edward Said calls European material civilization and culture. We can begin to define Hellenism along the lines of Said's Orientalism, as it also expresses, in Said's words, and represents that part of culturally and even ideologically as a mode of discourse with supporting institutions, vocabulary, imagery, doctrines, and even colonial bureaucracies and colonial styles. We may also think about Hellenism along the lines of V.Y. Mudimbe's, what V.Y. Mudimbe calls the idea of Africa, an idea which is a product of the West and was conceived and conveyed through conflicting systems of knowledge, in Mudimbe's words. However, unlike the colonial discourses, libraries and epistemic institutions which formulate the colonial and governing epistemes of Orientalism and the idea of Africa, which are over-determinations from without, Hellenism is a self-inventing system of knowledge that traces modern Western knowledge practices to Greco-Roman origins. In his Black Athena, Martin Bernal argues that there are two conflicting models about Greek origin, the ancient and the Aryan models. Now, the ancient model is one which populates Greek antiquity with, I suppose, a more, diverse cost and roots Greek antiquity and its civilization to Kemet, right? The super empire that was Kemet. But then there's the Aryan model, which has whitewashed Greco-Roman antiquity and Greek civilization, and produces these images of Greek civilization as if it was completely Aryan, or what we call today European. This model doesn't only just reconstruct the Greco, like the images of Greco-Roman society and philosophy that we have today, but it's also a model that is largely entrenched in the spirit and the logic of colonialism, one which is not only found in our modern age, but is rooted back to the power contestation of Greco-Roman or larger Mediterranean and near Middle Eastern political societies. So that's basically the root of that colonial logic. It's from what Martin Bernal and Mudimbe call, Aryanism, that colonial logic that basically whitewashes history, but is also found in those ancient societies. You see roots of it already existing within it. Hellenism emerges from this whitewashed form or model of Greek origin, the Aryan model, which was largely reconstructed by Western scholars since the end of the 18th century, has not only sought to reproduce ancient Greece as racially and culturally homogeneous, but it has strategically positioned it as the source of Western civilization and knowledge. As early modern Western scholarship, historiography, and various portions of its discursive machinery were inventing the ideas of the Orient, the African, and the Aboriginal, as primitive outsiders, they were also inventing the idea of self-contained and self-constituting European civilization. These were intermingled and symbiotic inventions that founded and institutionalized the myth of Western civilization on the grounds of what Mudimbe says is racism and continental chauvinism into our historiography or philosophy or writing history. By way of Mudimbe, we can take this thesis further by arguing that the symbiosis and co-constitution of these separate models, for example, or for instance, Orientalism, the idea of Africa, and the Aryan model of Greek origin, are all unified into a singular, all-encompassing epistemic paradigm of power, which is now what we call Hellenism. The epistemic paradigm, or this knowledge system, holds all colonial reality, or rather reigns over all colonial reality. Bernal understands the ruling paradigm as what he calls the generalized models or patterns of thought applied to many or all aspects of reality as seen by an individual or community. As a paradigmatic and hegemonic knowledge system or episteme, Hellenism has become the ubiquitous fabric of knowledge production in power centers of the colonial force. It does not only signify the ruling episteme, but it also encompasses temporal suspensions of colonized epistemes by pulling their telos towards the direction of its own historical motion and reproduction. So my argument, drawing from Mudimbe and Bernal, is that Hellenism, or this Greek-centered model of politics and history, didn't end in antiquity. I mean, the way that our moderator is a historian, and the way that history is narrated, it's as if it's this progressive, story, or this progressive narrative of one system overtaking another, and then that system itself being overtaken by the next system. And so it seems as if history is in this constant stage of evolution, what Hegel called dialectics. But, from the perspective that I work from, which is an African-centered or a mythologically centered concept of reality and metaphysics, history is in no way progressive, nor does it abolish the old. It seems that the source of Hellenism has constantly reproduced itself in what we call today modern politics. And so time hasn't been linear, it's actually been circular, and it's been a spiral. And again, you will see that as the argument develops. So Hellenism is interesting because it's a colonial model of power, instead of it being a civilization that is expensive. So it basically swallows everything that it touches and uses the forces of politics within the societies that it colonizes. It uses all of those sources of power, swallows them to self-engineer. Fanon spoke about this in Ratchet of the Earth, when he said that, the interesting thing about the Western historiographical system is that it not only lies to the native and says you have no history. If in anything, it sucks up the native's history to basically embold or to expand its own story of power. And this we see even in the cultural space. We see in various museums where African artifacts and indigenous artifacts and various other things, various other epistemic tools are sort of housed, and those are even used as monuments, not of those old and quote unquote dead civilization, but as monuments of the West, expansion. So that's basically the ritualistic machinations of Hellenism. This means that there is, as I just said, a ritualistic machination which not only repeats, but also eternalizes the Hellenistic models of power and society, which is inherent to the paradigm. Hellenistic frameworks group what it perceives as like phenomena, that is, phenomena that it conceptualizes as having the same kind of necessary qualities / properties into a class or a type. From this classificatory system, it breeds and produces categories such as politics and tragedy, and it breeds them separately. And I mean, this is also very evident in the social world with, categories like such as race and gender, that groups and typifies people. You even see it in the abstract realm, which is basically what I'm arguing, that even in abstract concepts like power, politics, tragedy, life, and whatsoever, we only have, or we've only now come to classify these as distinct and many times non-relational because of this colonial logic that is imbibed in Hellenism and its metaphysics. So from this classificatory system, it breeds and produces categories such as politics and tragedy, as I've just said. In Godinian terms, Hellenism has ontologized politics. Thus, Hellenism constrains our capacity to understand, cultivate, and practice politics beyond the rituals and institutions established by the Aryan practices in ancient Greece. The theoretical practice of classifying or typifying politics and then comparing it to other kinds of classes of events leads to the reduction of politics to mere substances, and thus transforms the force of politics into a mere object. My suggestion is that we need to move toward a fluid method of conceptualization that gives us an account of, one, politics not as a class of events, but as a kind of shifting, transforming, and ever-evolving phenomenon. Two, the account must move us from the fixed metaphysics of substance politics to the transformational metaphysics of evental politics. The account must provide a theoretical matrix, a system of analysis, so to speak, that is a method to observe and measure the phenomena that shifts and transforms with the moving currents of evental politics, or say evental political tragedy, if we compound the event of politics with that of tragedy, for example. Okay, so just if we, I'm just going to give a synopsis of this because I fear, time is not on my side and there's a lot to explain. But yeah, I mean, in the next portion of the argument or of the essay, I speak about, politics and how our idea of politics, as I've been saying, is firmly rooted in, and in fact, it's the reproduction of the Greco-Roman city-state. So the colonial state, for example, or the settler colonial state, the model that we find here in Abiyala, what is now called the United States of America, we find it in occupied Azania, and we find it on various sites on the Earth's surface. That colonial model is firmly a reproduction of the Greek city-state. The Greek city-state is founded on two models. The first model is the insider-outside model. The outsider or the refugee, the foreigner, is classified as an outsider, as a projection of the wilderness, as a projection of, the uncivilized, while the insider is basically where politics is institutionalized, transformed into an object that can only be circulated by the ruling class. So only, members of the ruling class who in the Greco-Roman state were, men who were part of the property owning and the slave owning class, were the ones who democracy could be circulated, or the ones who could, basically have access to democracy and have access to power and politics, while the working class of that society, the slave class of that society, and the refugee class of that society were excluded from the political process. As you can see, this has been continuously reproduced. It was reproduced, in the earlier stage of colonialism, reproduced in the apartheid system, the apartheid model. We saw that in occupied Azania. We've also seen the apartheid model, or we're more recently seeing it vividly in occupied Palestine, where only a particular class, a racialized class of so-called racially superior humans have access to the machinations of power. And we see it today in occupied Azania and in various other, sites of politics or states rather, where, in South Africa, we experiencing something that people are beginning to call economic apartheid, but we also experience spatial apartheid, where those who are closer to the inner city, meaning those who are closer to the locations of the racialized ruling class, have access to power and all the privileges that come with power. And so we're basically all enfolded, even though the Greco-Roman model is not an invention of all the peoples of the world, specifically those who are now colonized. It is a model that we are all encased and captured within, and thus we circulate that model by participating in the game of power. Yeah, and it's obviously a game that we all unwittingly and non-consensually exist within, because it has transformed from a mere colonial model to now a hegemonic model that defines all of our systems of knowledge, and more importantly for my work, all of our systems of reality and all of our systems of imagination. We've begun to imagine power in exactly, or as a model of, the Greco-Roman Aryan model of power. So that's the argument I produce in the next section, right? Yeah, and so I speak in various levels of how this model was invented and how this model, this Greco-Roman model of the insider-outsider paradigm of bare life and, what Foucault later called biopolitics or necropolitics and biopolitics. Those encased in biopolitics are determined to live, those encased out of it in necropolitics are basically, sort of like become the deathly subjects of that power model. Yeah, so I speak about how this model, as we know it, is actually firmly rooted not only in history or merely in history, it's actually rooted in the metaphysical framework of substance politics. And that is also a reproduction and rooted in an even older model of power or the power game, and that's within the Greco-Roman mythological system, where the gods have the exclusive preserve and ownership of power, and humans and everything, and every other race or class of existence is basically subjected to them, and they represent what Georgia Agamben calls bare life. Again, this game, this imaginary model reproduced today, where Black people are the firm representation of bare life, or what the Afro-pessimists call social death. And the European class, specifically European class of property owners, are the proper representation of life and power itself. So my basic argument is that history and politics, even metaphysics, are all ritualizations. Very important to note that word, ritualization, reconstruction of their mythic origin. This is not an argument that's original to me. People like Wilson Harris have made this argument. People like Credo Mutwa have made this argument. In fact, Credo Mutwa makes a very deep case of this argument. And hopefully we'll get to discuss that at another time. But let me just continue with the thought here. So anyway, I get to a point where I say that, apartheid, especially if you want to study apartheid in South Africa, if you really want to study apartheid, I mean, obviously look at the history, look at the institutions of apartheid, but look at the mytho-metaphysics of apartheid, and don't just study Hendrik Verwoerd when you want to study apartheid. Study someone else older than him and probably even inspired his entire school of thought or his entire schooling. You have to study Socrates, right? Or rather, even after Socrates, you have to study more specifically, you have to study Aristotle. So Aristotle has the idea, and I think a lot of us, especially as Black radicals, have inherited this idea that politics is highly attached to speech making or to the makings, the reconstructions, or the reproduction rather of a discursive economy. And basically this discursive economy is just like politics and the power game, can only be populated by a particular class, who reproduce it. And so Aristotle, when he makes an argument or makes, some positions about the slave, he says that the slave doesn't have the power of speech. This is what distinguishes the citizen and the slave. The citizen has the power of speech, the right to live, so to speak, and the slave lacks that. And so, so this is what builds into bare life. However, Xu Zhenjiang argues that Aristotle's position is the genesis, the very root of the West's later racial ideology and practice, which has been a footnote to Aristotle and his theory of natural slavery. A very important and powerful point there, because Aristotle makes the position that slaves are not created and constructed by human greed or various economic systems that necessitates, the class of slaves, but that they are natural because they are those without political speech or, speech that produces, or language that produces power. And unfortunately, in our position as Africans in this massive captive system of capitalism and modernity, we have been classified or ritualized to reproduce the character or reenact the character in Aristotle's concept of natural slavery. He continues, Jiang, that is to demonstrate that for Aristotle, because non-Greeks are barbarians and barbarians are natural slaves, all Greeks are natural basically all barbarians or outside barbarians or those who are outside of Greece are natural slaves. The status of barbarians is thus ontological. Thus, Hellenism transforms historical conflicts and biases launched by Athenians against foreign nationals into metaphysical categories used to classify humans who are excluded from the elite circles of the Western ruling class. By so ontologizing its constructed other, Hellenism also ontologizes fluid and immense forces like politics and power into the exclusive preserve and property of the ideological progeny of the Greek city-states ruling class. These are historically scandalous transformations because they inhibit the practice of politics from evolving into anything other than the antiquated model of the Greek city-state. So the genius of this particular colonial model, and we have to attribute it as, a genius model because, at least in my study of history, I've never seen anything like it, or none of us have seen anything like it, is that, where other models of power or other models of society treat power as a force that flows in, through different mediums, through different institutions. So for example, the classical or the very simple system of African monarchy doesn't treat power as the preserve, or the exclusive preserve of the monarch, but it sees power as distributed through multiple channels and multiple mediums because it treats power as a force, that touches all institutions in society and that can shapeshift at any moment in time, right? And that treatment of power is really what enables the society to reproduce, the game of power, the game of politics in that way. So you see power distributed among, say, the priest class or the knowledge producing class. You see power, distributed and practiced by the monarch. You see power distributed, practiced by the property owning class. So power is distributed through multiple channels and mediums, and it's treated like a spirit. So that's basically how most civilizations and societies treat the force of power. And even, let's say, with the Buddhists, who treat power as nirvana, as an emptiness. so to speak. It still operates, even though it cannot be owned, but one can sort of collapse into that power or sort of ascend towards that power. Even that Buddhist model treats power as a force. But what's interesting about the Greco-Roman model is that it treats power like an object, and therefore it reproduces the game of power in that manner. It reproduces the game of power as if it were an object, and thus it begins to treat even those who are subject to power as if they were objects, as if they are locked within an ontology that they cannot escape from. You're black, you're born black, you become black, you die black. You're in this sort of tautological cycle of existence. You're encased within the object of blackness because this is how the system classifies you. So because it's a classificatory system, and it's a system that treats forces as if they were objects, it can easily reproduce itself and expand itself in the like manner. Unlike a system that treats power as if it were a force, let's say even a multi-dimensional force, that system is sort of like indebted to power rather than owning power. It's that kind of system. The last part, sort of like, moves within the motions of power rather than trying to capture power. So that's the problem with the Greco-Roman system, and that's why it's been able to successfully reproduce itself and sort of reconstruct itself through the colonial state and through the settler colonial state in particular. So at this point of the argument, I mean, it's more elaborated, and how, I elaborate more in terms of how the Greco-Roman city-state has been able, or the different levels at which it reproduces power as if it were an object. But at this point, I make very clear a number of propositions that I hold in this paper. So at this point, we have this given statement. We take the polis, or the city-state, to refer to the original Greco-Roman city-states and its successive mutations leading to the modern nation-state and the colonial state, including both its settler colonial form and the remote colonial form. So the settler colonial form, seen normally through British models, and the remote colonial form through Belgian and French models. But all of that really doesn't matter because the root is within the Greek-Roman state, right? The first statement we make, or the first position we hold, is that politics is a pre-polis force. It exists way beyond the Greco-Roman state. The problem with a lot of Black radical thought is that, it treats and even refers to politics as originated, produced by, and the ritualized form of the Greco-Roman state. I mean, you see this, in many of our most revered authors' works, where they basically refer to the origin of politics to the city-state. But we need to move outside of that and recognize that politics is a spirit, and I insist on the word spirit. Okay.
Mwalimu, we've got 10 minutes to go on the lecture.
Got you. Okay, thank you. And I insist on the point that politics is a pre-Greco-Roman form, because politics is seen in various civilizations and even in societies that did not expand themselves or refuse the urge to, transform themselves into quote unquote mega civilizations. Politics is still an operational spirit there. Again, I did say I insist on the word spirit because it's actually a very beautiful concept that we can do a lot of things with, but it, more importantly for me, emphasizes the point of politics as a force, and a force that sort of like, can be engineered in various ways, but is also at many times self-engineering. A force just like time, a force just like sound, So the second position we now take is that the polis claims to produce politics through the mechanisms of its discursive economy, that is, giving certain people or giving a class of people, the property of speech. But the privatized forms of that discursive economy and the ontologization of phenomena at its quantum most metaphysical scales reduces politics to the stagnated forms of objectification, where politics circulates within the discursive economy as a mere thing amongst things, in Fanon's words, rather than limitless zones of transformation. And that's why the word spirit is important. So we want to think about politics as the radical force, especially as the Black radical force, as a limitless zone of transformation. That's how we should begin to think of power, rather than to think of power as an object that can be institutionalized, okay? The third position is that the polis or the city-state reduces politics from a force into an object which is privately circulated, consumed by members of its temporarily or historically designated ruling class. Note that as the state mutates, specifically this modern and colonial state that we are under right now, the designation of its ruling class changes, but the category remains. Due to its bifurcated symbolic field, the state is eternally split between political life and bare life. The state populates the former with its ruling classes while condemning its outsiders to the latter. Politics is produced in the general discursive economy, but it is privately owned, circulated, and consumed by members of its political life. We take political life and bare life to be merely socially constructed classes, not the natural categories Aristotle conceived them to be. The fifth position we hold is that due to its monadic metaphysical formation, the state never evolves into a true empire or into anything outside of the Greco-Roman colonial model. So even if we say we're going to transform the Nigerian state, transform the Congolese state, it's still rooted and it's still set on the roots, or rather the groundwork, right? The metaphysical groundwork of the Greco-Roman state. And it's going to reproduce the same cycles, the same institutions, and the same modes of operation that were originally found in that Greek-Roman state. So basically, the state has its ancestry in the Greek-Roman state. That's the basic argument, right? But it expands by reproducing itself in the form of colonies. So yeah, that's the force of eternalization. But now I'm going to move toward the suggestion. How do we transform our metaphysics and our cosmology as Pan-Africanists from this Greco-Roman force to something that has more vitality and that can hopefully reproduce a wider system of justice and a wider system of distributing power? I say, taking from Kimbadede Foucault's cosmograms, and he's a practitioner of the Bantu cosmogram, is that we need to look toward that system of reality, right? So I only have a few minutes, so let me just read this last portion. So to end, it is important that we note that theorists from various traditions and fields have formulated highly sophisticated theories of reality as a force field. So that's how we need to treat reality in order to treat politics in the same manner. Notable amongst these are theoretical physicists like Michael Faraday, and more important to me and my work is Bakongo cosmologists who have mapped the notion and convergence of forces through the Bakongo cosmogram. Faraday's theory of force fields maintains that if one places iron fillings over a magnet, one finds that the iron fillings create a spider web-like pattern that fills up all space. These are Faraday's likes of forces, which graphically describe how the force fields of electricity and magnetism permeate space. Empty space to Faraday was not empty at all, but was filled with lines of forces that could make distant objects move. The Bakongo cosmogram, which precedes Faraday's spider-like graphic graphing of space, also maintains that reality is vastly populated by forces which can transfigure themselves into objects and other kinds of existence. So existence is not only populated by objects, right? The Bakongo cosmogram maps the transformation of a force through 4 different phases of reality. Each phase is said to be a cluster of dimensions. Thus, a force is subject to transform and reconfigure its existence at any given time. At the center of this transforming force field is what Kimbwandende Fouquet calls the V. The V, he says in his own words, has a standing ground, the untouchable dark matter that constitutes the printing dark room of realities. From this dark room, pictures and ideas become realities in human minds, which channel them into transformation processes that lead them to tangible reality. So instead of pinning our reality to Aristotle's substance, we need to pin reality to the V that is mapped in the Bakongo cosmogram. The V is the core of all circles inside which V stands, says Fouquet. These Vs are individual or collective, material or immaterial, biological or ideological. This displays the transformational potential of a force because it can appear at multiple grids in different and sometimes oppositional forms at the same time. This also demonstrates that a force can converge with others in order to produce a compound force, or a force can expel its essence for another, or constitute itself with contrary essences such that the superpositional level, at the superpositional level, it can obey anti-harmonious laws. Take how the force of politics appears in Biko's On Death, for example. Steve Biko posits that the force of death, and more importantly, the method of death, not only speech, which is what Aristotle holds, can generate insurgent discursive economies within the broad scope of the oppressed classes. Given that the innumerable deaths of oppressed peoples is a trans-historical event, it happens throughout history, the discursive economies produced therefrom cover a wide temporal and spatial field. For Biko, these methods of death can itself be a politicizing thing. Thus, the spatio-temporal expense of the discursive economies generated by death can themselves generate a new dimension of politics. It is important to note that the oppressed classes can construct themselves as a counter-polity against regimes of terror through political phenomenological processes like Black consciousness. So there are always multi-dimensional scales of politics practice produced and occupied by the oppressed at any given point in time. Consequently, as Biko transforms the torture he is subjected to into a fight, he propels himself to engage with these various dimensions of politics while simultaneously generating new strands of politics. In other words, he transforms a scene of subjection in that holding cell where, the holding cell also becomes a coffin for him, constructed under the laws of substance metaphysics in the apartheid state and the colonial mutations of the city and now nation state into a scene of insurrection under the laws of time phenomena metaphysics. In this way, Biko shows us how to cultivate a liberatory reality. So the whole point on Biko is that just by his mere practice, his mere practice of death, that is, he's producing a different metaphysics of politics, a different way of practicing and imagining power that we need to expand on in order to create and cultivate a new reality of life, a new reality of existence that banishes the Aristotelian and the colonial model of substance metaphysics and launches us into, a metaphysics grounded in spirit and transformation and justice. I think that's my submission for today. Yes, I can see I'm already cut of time.
We give thanks, Mwalimu. That couldn't have been an easy lecture. I I I feel for you having had to squeeze all that into the few minutes we could afford you, but you did stellar work. And yeah, you took me on a journey. You got me excited, you know. You got me worried. So, you know, I'm excited because, you know, I maintain that Africa has never had a problem of knowledge and capacity. That's not our problem. We've got many other problems, you know. Just sitting here listening to you for 40 odd minutes, you just corroborated the point that knowledge is not what we lack, you know. We know precisely where we are, where we ought to go, things we ought to do, what is being used against us and so forth, right? And you got me worried, you know, when you touched on the Hellenism, you know, I've looked at it a few instances, but not the way you painted it tonight. You took me on a very interesting journey, and I've got a large assignment from here, you know, to read more. And you know, here's a point that I want to comment on that you made on power. Others viewing it as a force, and others viewing it as an object. You know, in the history that I've learned, it has largely been used as a force. And I married this to another point you made earlier on when you said politics is many things, but mostly merely an art of speech making. When you take those 2 points and marry them, you realize in a context of Azania, for example, power is a force that gets the politicians to dance to the capital's tune because power lies with capital. They sit with the means to manifest all that humans wish for in today's age. And in a political system, they use that power as a force to dance to their tune. The capital wins. We've got politicians that are liberals, you know, but it is actually the capital that rules because of the notion of the power being viewed as or used as a force. And I don't want to hog the spotlight as I am the MC and the moderator of the evening. I'm going to list my 2 questions with you, and then we're going to open the floor for our attendants and participants for the evening to enlist their questions and comments. But here's my 2 questions for you, Molimo. When you spoke on Hellenism, and I take this also with your background of having studied a lot of Umakhosi Vusamazulu Muthu's work, in an environment like Africa, we have a phenomenon where the invader or the oppressor has had to identify chiefs or kings that were very vocal against this notion of oppression. Those kings that were murdered and their heads beheaded and taken away to Europe. In your study of Hellenism, what would you link that to? It would be ritualistic from a distance. What would you put that? What do you think they're doing with these heads that they have taken away of our kings? Or Hinza, we still have not found that of Khalishiwe in South Africa. And I've studied this intensely. You have many of those in Zimbabwe. You have those in Uganda and across the continent. So what would you put that to? And secondly, my question on the philosophies. Do you, as a decolonial theorist, do you see us shaking our shackles off while we still operate under the auspices of the Roman Dutch statutes. Is it possible to be free in Africa while we operate under the Roman Dutch statutes? That would be my two quick questions. And I want to ask quickly, Mr. T and my other colleagues, Ebukosini, I'm just quickly looking through my list here. Please help me identify questions on the charts, and where we have got hands that are raised, please help me note those, because we've got a very long list tonight. And also those that are in the chat, I need your assistance in noting those questions and comments. So while we go on to that, Mwalimu Ayabulela, you can maybe respond to my two questions or comments. And then we'll just enlist other questions as we go.
Yeah, okay, thank you so much. In terms of the first question, the ritualized beheading of, insurgent or chiefs and kings, or those who were, forming insurrections against the emerging power of the colonial state or the colonial forces. You've captured it well, that it's part of the ritualistic machinations of the Hellenistic paradigm. This is a practice, it's a practice of conquest that you not only saw through, medieval times or medieval European practices, but you saw it even in earlier models of power, right? It's a sign and symbol of conquest. So it's definitely encased within, just the ritualistic traditions of the game of conquest, of coloniality. So, definitely there's something we need to study about, what does this particular symbol mean? But we can make a few assumptions based on some of the symbolic knowledge that we have from the Western imaginary. The way that the West sees power, it sees it as a unified body, hence the body politic, right? Just think about how they, think about medieval, early modern, and even ancient forms of, Western ancient forms of how, power was symbolized, right? The idea is that the state is the complete body with different arms. Even today, we call, the different, parts of the state, or the different power centers of the state, the different arms of the state, the legislature, the judiciary, the administration. And at the helm of the state is the head. The head is always symbolized through the monarch or the central power force, right? Because the head, it's also a patriarchal symbol. The head is the thinking matter. You see it even in the domestic fold of the colonial society, even the colonized society. The patriarch is the head of the family. The family is a unified body. So the beheading, I think, is within that symbolic ritual of, decapitating the power hold of the entire body. You take away the head, you take away the king, you take away the operations, even the sort of like the power force of the entire body. So beheading the king is a symbol that we have destroyed your center, and we have destroyed the power source, of society. But also unbeknownst to the colonial forces, specifically to the missionary, maybe that's why the missionary was so important, is that the power center of African societies does not lie with the king. Let me at least speak for the Bantu systems. It doesn't lie with the king or solely with the king. It also lies highly with those who are the spiritual practitioners, or the knowledge practitioners, and other institutions as well. So power is not a centralized body, as I said, power is a force, and forces don't have bodies. You know, that's why even, and you know, this is why Credo Mutra is really important, and I really just beseech all of us to study him more seriously. For example, when he speaks about unkulunkulu, even way before he speaks about unkulunkulu, when he's speaking about the tale of spirits, he thinks about deities not through bodies. Whereas when you look at the Greco-Roman symbolic field, all the deities are embodied, even the titans, you know. It's only deities that precede the titles that are not embodied. But for Mutua, you know, the highest forms of deities are not embodied. These are transforming spirits, right? That are highly imbued in, you know, time, you know, the force of time. And even unkulunkulu, you know, abanye bathi ngumkhulu abomkhulu or umkhulu kubomkhulu. But the way Mutua imagines unkulunkulu is as a great spirit, not as a great god. You know, it's not an embodied force, you know. So, you know, for us, power, as I've been arguing, or at least these are my early suggestions, power is a force, it's an expansive force. And it's a force that's multidimensional, or it's a force that replicates through various dimensions instead of being centralized through the body. But, you know, when the West sees the other, it sees the other as if it was seeing an image of itself. That's the narcissistic part of its power, you know, like Narcissus, who basically, you know, is basically in this eternal, you know, curse of constantly gazing at himself. So it does that. And Mudimbe also makes this case. So when it saw our systems, it thought that our systems were capsules or were replicas of its system. So by beheading Hinsa and beheading other kings and monarchs, you know, it basically was asserting that we have destroyed your head, you know, and your body is no longer unified. It's decapitated, it's mutilated. And, you know, of course, we must get the remains of our ancestors back. It's very important. But, you know, part of being in the ancestral fold of reality is that we are also part and parcel in, you know, the cultivation of power. So we need to transform and sort of reconfigure ourselves in symbolic ways that are not anyway recognizable to the West. I think that's where we can win. In terms of the shackles, definitely we can't operate, and we will never be free if we're still reproducing any form of Hellenistic power models, including its laws. So even with the Roman statutes, you know, with the civil law and even customary law, all of those, you know, as is recently argued in the South African public domain by some politicians, all of those are replications of, you know, Roman forms of law. And you want to, you wonder as a student of history, my moderator, if like, you know, if the West has developed so much in its history, why does it, you know, retain Roman forms of law? I mean, if it did away with the Roman Empire and we're now under this Christian super empire, and even that has been done away by the capitalist secular empire, why are we still, you know, so, you know, enfolded by Roman law? Simply because society loves to ritualize itself. That's why all societies are very obsessed with the idea of eternity and immortality. And, you know, truly nothing has changed. It's just different forms. So the answer for me, at least, is no, we definitely cannot do it. We can't. Yeah.
Yeah, you know. So yeah, it's a very worrying position we find ourselves in. And but without hogging the spotlight, I'm going to acknowledge Tsakani Khoza to give us his or her question or comment. Tsakani, you've got the floor.
Riperile minjani.
Riperile. Ifukile minjani. Do I say ifukile even at this time?
Mipukile marikona mos marilo.
Rikona.
So, Ikentengo Pusesi Aya for the lessons that we've actually got exposed to. There's so many things that I believe as Africans we are not fully aware of. And the more we grow in awareness to it, it raises even more questions within us. For instance, the question that kept on boiling up throughout the lesson is, since we have Sanusas in Africa, since we have spiritual teachers, since we have people who have initiated and have done so much work to work with the cosmos, heal people energetically, heal people with plants, what is the whole purpose of us still going to these institutions, getting master's degrees to debate of what Aristotle did here and there, when we have practical things that we should be doing as Africans right now, with the information that we have, with the information that can over and counter the current legal systems that Europeans have actually established for us. We have scholars. You can also look into the people who graduated before you and the people who are coming through to graduate after you. What roadmap are you creating to ensure that our own Sanusas, the high cosmic beings, the people who are doing the spirit work, are actually recognized for what they're doing, not just only reading Indaba, my children, but practicing Indaba. So I just wanted to check where we taking all of this after this. What are we doing?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question, Ms. Tsakani, Ms. Khoza. So for me, I mean, I am of the avid belief, I'm trained as, as a warrior by some of my seniors like Nihanda, who's here, Zandi Khatebe. I'm also trained as a warrior by some of, our scholar ancestors. That's how I see my position. And, as warriors, it's not enough that we just resist or we try to, exit the power game, exit the power center. But I do think it's important that just like, the guerrillas that came before us, we infiltrate different parts of the power center. Our work is important wherever we are, whether we're building alternative institutions in our various communities, or whether we are in the university participating there, or even in corporate spaces, doesn't matter wherever you are. The work is really important. And we're also in practice. Part of practice means we experiment, we fail, and then we rebuild, So, practice is not always perfecting it. We're not in the Messiah game of Jesus Christ. We don't believe this is the one answer and we should all, like sheep to a shepherd, move within that line. I don't think we operate like that as Africanists. We operate exactly through what I noticed as experiment, we fail, we build, experiment, fail, build, and get others on our side as well. And we experiment in multiple facets. That's why I always exaggerate this point of multidimensionality. So I do think that it's important that, some of us who find ourselves in academia, that we remain there and we fight and we strategize and we unite. Just like Marcus Garvey said, we build institutions wherever we find ourselves, and in various other spaces, we operate just like that. And sometimes building an institution means building your model to such a grand level that it swallows the model that wanted to swallow it. You just have to be ruthless in your logic in that way. You know what I'm saying? So, so yes, you're right. We definitely need to study more of our Sanusis, but more importantly, politically conscious Sanusis, especially for us as, political activists. It's important that we align ourselves with their works and we align ourselves with their institutions. So Credo Mutua has a village there. What are we, for example, as political activists? So people like me who are metaphysicians, I saw Memory Biwa is here. She's also doing incredible work on memory in Namibia. Maybe we need to also, work towards saying, listen, there are institutions we've left behind, institutions in Soweto. Sister Sandy with BHK and myself, we're working on institutions like Funda Center. Baba Buntu has built this institution, Ebukosini. The moderator has his own institution, and I'm sure various other people. How do our institutions communicate with each other in order to cultivate the force field of power? I think that's a question we need to operate from as we cultivate our practice, rather than all of us exiting, going to one place and behaving as if we're looking toward a Messiah and ritualizing, the messianic logic of Christianity. That to me doesn't work. I believe in destroying wherever you are and rebuilding. Yeah. So that's my answer.
Very powerful that. And Nahanda, you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you so much. Well done, Comrade Aya. That was a very profoundly stimulating and intellectually enriching session, Siyabonga. You've partially answered my question. And because I joined a bit late, struggled with technology, I suspect that I might have missed, some of the things that you raised earlier. But I think some of the things that you shared got me thinking about, the Palestinian struggle for statehood, right? And the broader implications of aspiring towards statehood, not just for Palestine, but for other communities or for other nations that are, under oppression. And this is despite the state's inherent mechanisms of violence and perpetual death. It seems as though, the only way that people can imagine being a community, a people, is through statehood. And I was just wondering what you would interpret, how you would interpret that tension between the quest for statehood or stateness and the evidence of the state itself as being fundamentally violent. And I also wanted to know if you perhaps foresee a movement towards some form of statelessness, and if so, how would you conceptualize that shift? And I'm also thinking about alternative forms of, socio-political organizations that existed prior the colonial context, particularly amongst, us in El Kebulan, and how these might offer insights into alternative models of socio-political organizations, and communities of livability.
And Mamani, please mute. Someone mute him.
It had to be Uputmens who interrupts. Yeah, but I'm just thinking, how do we think beyond, the nation state as a mode of being, and especially for those of us who are Black radical activist scholars and occupied as Azania, how do we subvert the colonial paradigm of power as domination, conquest, and perpetual violence to sort of reinvent it as a life, force, Black love, and something that also connects to cosmocentric ways of being in the world. In other words, how to subvert power to end the world as we know it, to borrow from Césaire. Thank you.
No, thank you so much, Sisandi. Those were very rich questions. In terms of state formations and those being fundamentally violent, I do agree with that. However, the way that, the Western colonial paradigm works, the way that Hellenism works, because it doesn't see anything outside itself. In order for, for people to have even an inch of life, to not be subjected to endless death, like what we see in Palestine and what we saw before 94, colonized subjects, at least in the way that we've practiced history and the way that we've understood reality before us, we see ourselves highly enclosed to the point where the only strategy we have is to replicate the power models of Europe, the power models of the West, in order to stop dying, or at least to suspend death for a few moments. It's not, we never stop dying. So I think the West, it's really interesting, like how they've built up reality. It's malicious, it's malignant, but it's very interesting because this sort of way of eternalizing themselves, like when Nietzsche says God is dead and the Ubermensch, the Superman, like sort of like, ascends to his helm, it means that the Western power center operates exactly like the God it killed, in order to entrench modernity. And that God sees nothing outside of himself. He wants to conquer everything, and everything needs to be molded in his concept of reality. And that's how our sense of politics works today. Ontologized politics works like that. So from what I see is that, Palestinians and everyone else colonized has no other alternative but to be pushed toward true state solution, independent state, and such like formations in order to at least, exist in some way or the other without being subjected to endless death. And again, it's a pattern we see over and over again. So that's how I perceive that struggle. And moving beyond the state, my suggestion, I agree with that. I don't think the state can offer us anything because it re-ritualizes the very same system that destroys and transforms vital nations such as ours into mere colonized subjects, and many times colonized, dead, or enslaved subjects. We have to move beyond the state. That was the problem of the 20th century Black radical movement and various other political movements, is that we didn't envision ourselves beyond states. This is why Sanusis are so important, because they have a wider cosmic view of reality, not just enclosed and time-bound visions of reality. I think we need to move toward empires. That's what we need to do. And building an empire is not a small thing, as we know historically. It takes a lot of time.
Yes.
It also takes a lot of violence. It takes a lot of knowledge, and it takes a lot of reimagining the order of life and existence. So we do need high ambition, and we need to really think about ways in which we can rebuild our empires, and that means basically we're going to be engaging in politics proper, and not just politics of integration or alternative politics or whatsoever. Yeah, it means that we really need to think about engaging and recultivating the force of politics proper, true politics. Yeah, so those are my answers to your questions. I agree that we definitely need to reinvent power as a life force, and through a cosmocentric view. This is why, going back to Ms. Koza's question, definitely we need to reconcile with our Sanusis, but not treat Sanusis as if they were messiahs or whatever. We're not in a Judeo-Christian mode of life. We exist in other modes of life. We treat our Sanusis as co-cultivators of this new reality. So yeah, I mean, definitely that's why I emphasize reality over everything. Because when we get the question and the puzzle of reality right, then we're gonna be on our way.
Okay, Walimu, I've got a comment here from Madimeja. I think he asks, how do we bring the idea of politics as a force into the current system of governance? He gives an example of democracy. That's the question.
No, my argument is that you can't. I mean, the current system of governance is one that ontologizes politics or transforms politics into an object. This current system cannot house politics as if it were a force, because this current system wants to and reproduces the ethic, the practice of, privately owned institutions of politics or privately owned mechanisms of politics. So if we can't, at least from my argument, I think if someone else wants to argue differently, I'm very welcome to hear them, and we can definitely debate the point. But from my observations and my studies so far, any way of integrating the Western model with an external model is a way of actually killing that external model, because this is a model, the Western model is interesting. The best part of how it's interesting is it has absolutely mastered conquest. That's its highest form of success. That's its true success. You know, other systems are successful in other ways, like producing justice, you know, producing equality and other virtues of political life. But this one has produced a very powerful force, which is conquest. And with a conquest model, there's really no negotiations. It's a model that swallows. It's a model that swallows you, and it's a model that takes your strategies from your external systems and, you know, and sort of uses them as, you know, as sort of engineering forces for its own system. Like, I think when Fanon made that observation about emptying, you know, empties our history and then calls our history its own history, like what they did with Kemet, or what they do with Kemet, you know, and various other sides of African history and power systems. Even, you know, with philosophy, they've successfully done that through Arianism, you know. So that's the logic of this current system of governance. It's not one that you can negotiate and perfectly integrate yourself in and create the synthetic or synthesized, you know, perfect model. Again, don't listen to Western philosophers, because even the idea of synthesization is the idea we get from Hegel, who's actually a mystic more than he is a philosopher, because he's studying the spirit of history and the spirit of the mind. And, you know, and he thinks that the end of history is created by the synthesization of opposing forces. I mean, when have opposing forces ever synthesized perfectly into a harmonious model? It just doesn't make basic sense.
It will never be harmonious.
Exactly. So harmony needs to be something that is not created by antagonism, like root antagonism. It has to be highly ingrained from the root, rather than finding harmony at the end of a conflict. It doesn't make basic sense. So it's not going to make sense as we reproduce it. We constantly are reproducing Western colonial models, even the most radical of us. And it's because of these metaphysical and imaginary frameworks. So yeah. So we need to think that, for me, we just need to think differently, and from there we'll create and practice differently. It's not that we take something we've learned from, you know, a Pan-African or an Afrocentric scholar and we say, you know, we want to integrate it here. It's like people who want to take veganism and integrate it into meat eating. You're still eating meat. You know, you can't integrate it. Those are opposing systems. So that it's the same thing with the governance and using indigenous models to improve Western governance. I mean, no.
So no, thank you for that response, Mwalimu. I've got a question on the chat from Sheena Satige. She asks, how do our institutions work together to cultivate a greater force of power?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a beautiful question. Yeah, I think that's a question we're all working on. And it's a question that I think it's an answer we will find in practice. The reason I really love studying African metaphysics and African cosmology is because there's never a fixed answer to a problem. You know, a problem is a riddle that you have to fix. You know, it's not like there's a defined answer somewhere in space and you have to go capture it. Like, you know, Plato's ideals, there's the answer to love. You must go fetch love, ascend to love. There's the answer to power. You must go fetch it. Or, you know, like the caveman climbing to the sunlight. There's no such thing. We solve problems in practice. So I operate from that ethic. And I think that's something we can collaborate on post this talk. I mean, it's something we're doing right now, right? It's something we're trying to figure out. Like, you know, Ebu Kosini inviting, you know, some students and members of Black House Collective, and we're thinking together, lending each other our knowledge, our work, you know. We're building in an attempt right now. But I think the most important thing that African institutions need to do, and something we are lacking right now is, and something we've been trying to build since the 18th century and beyond, is communicability. We need to communicate more, you know, support each other in our various ventures, and collectively build, manifestos, collectively build programs, and, also bind ourselves to an ethic, like Sis Sandy calls it the Sobukwe ethic. It's something she's trying to build. Bind ourselves to an ethic which is inalienable, to our practice. You can't think as an individual, and even as an institution, you can't think of yourself individually outside of the other institutions or sister institutions. You need to be bound by an ethic, and wherever you go, you need to sort of like, reproduce that ethic as well. So for me, I mean, those are the basic principles, the ethics, common ethics, moving and transcending individualism, even at the institutional level, and also, communication. But more than anything, we really need to transform our models of thinking. I think our conceptualization, very much deeply entrenched in the colonial model, need to move past that, find other citations, and practice what those ideas are saying, instead of like what we've done, for example, to people like Kurumucha as African institutions. What we've done to our Sanusis is a crime, a high crime, in true African society. Like, when when Bob Marley said, like when you were speaking about prophets, how long shall they kill our prophets while we stand aside and look?
Yes.
Alienating ourselves from our Sanusis, from our thinkers, from our visionaries is really also one root of our decadence. So we need to align and, begin to build in various ways, and practice, fail, rebuild, practice, fail, rebuild. That's what's really important, instead of just being in our different cycles and operating individually, thinking individually you'll succeed while others fail. It's still part of the Western ethic of individualism. Yeah, so that's my thoughts. But I'm happy to hear from everyone else, what the answer to that question is. Yeah.
Certainly. Now, I want to pick your brain on something, Walimu. What would you say language? What role does language play in our efforts in breaking free from these shackles? And let me give you a small background as to where this question comes from. Very recently, when Israel invaded Gaza, I mean, they say Gaza, but we know it's about Palestinians, and it's the issue of the land thing. I wrote an article that week saying that the reality of it is that if that setting was somewhere in the Congo Basin, for example, in the Bakongo cosmogram, a person is not allowed to kill a person over something that they don't own or can create, something like land. So in essence, if that incident happened somewhere in the Congo Basin, there wouldn't have even been a case to answer in a court, because none of that is allowed, just based on the language alone. Would you say that also language, us using foreign languages as former colonies, plays a role in retardation of our liberation processes?
Yes, no, definitely. I think you're right in the sense that language is such a powerful medium of reproducing the Hellenistic model of power. Because every language is highly imbued by a conceptual system, just in its grammar, in its logic, in its ends. Language is not stagnant. Again, the West has really blindsided all of us, even in its knowledge centers, into thinking about things as if they were individual objects that don't communicate with each other. Language communicates with power. Language communicates with government. Language communicates with cosmology, right? It communicates with the imagination. So where we find ourselves is that due to various struggles of integration, specifically those anti-colonial and post-colonial struggles after the 50s, is that through integration, we've also really bastardized, as you're saying, various models of thinking, you know. So we've treated language by itself, and then we call that the study of literature. You treat wisdom by itself and you called it the study of philosophy. You treat power by itself and call it the study of politics. You treat money and commerce by itself, call it the study of finance. That's ridiculous. Only a society that is firstly overpopulated with subjects, you know, and only a society that has conquest as its, you know, primary and only mission is a society that says, listen, we are overly populated with subjects and our industry is overly populated with various interests. We need to dice them apart and create these separate faculties that do not communicate with each other, you know. And that's why things are so segregated, such that, you know, we don't see language as an important medium of power, both the power of the repressor and the oppressor, and the power of those in resistance. And so we definitely need to, you know, work on the language question. It's not a small question, it's an important question. You know, English can only take us so far, but unless English is highly populated with indigenous concepts, you know, for example, Credo Mutwa, I'm just using him as an example because he's the person I study very seriously. You know, Credo Mutwa could have easily conceptualized and imagined uNkulunkulu, just like how, you know, the Hebraic model imagines Yahweh as a personified entity that is, you know, that is also a terrorist, or that is also, you know, a great, you know, empire who wants to consolidate the world and define all of the world, monopolize it. But he imagined it differently by using concepts from, you know, the Nguni system, from the Bantu system. So unless we play with language and, you know, sort of like populate the language that we have with our concepts and make sure that we circulate that language, firstly amongst ourselves to build our institutions and to generate power amongst these institutions, before we share that language with the colonial and hegemonic system, then can we transform language and make it a system of communicability that communicates with other facets of knowledge and conceptualization. And another thing I think is really important is that we need to also, you know, democratize language. The problem with us scholars is that we think that we're the only ones who can produce language, who can produce concepts, who can produce the discursive economy. And that's not only true of scholars, it's true also of the elite class. And so, you know, in the true fashion of Pan-Africanism and, you know, seeking a different alternative to the world that we have right now, we need to democratize these ideas and unshackle them from the objectification of the West and treat concepts as if they were a force of spirit, treat time as if it were a force and a spirit, treat language as if it is a force or a spirit, rather than thinking we have the sole property of language or politics just because, you know, you have multiple degrees in that particular subject. Again, it's nonsensical. So yeah, I mean, yeah, that's my answer and my view on the issue of language. We definitely either need to, you know, go back to our languages and excavate very deep and rich concepts, use those concepts to rebuild our power, or we need to repopulate this language with our concepts and our forces of power and, you know, sort of like sift it of all the toxic, you know, sort of like models that are emboldened in the language. And then we need to take power and use it as an engineering force of our power system, rather than taking our concepts, building it in their language and using it as an engineering force of their power system. So we need to think like engineers.
Very
basically.
insightful.
Yeah.
No, thank you for that response, Mwalimu. It's language is a very powerful tool, and you know, as Mwalimu Nguki Wationgo put it as well, you know, politics are also the language that you are conducting them in, you know. So yeah. I've got a question here for you, Mwalimu, from Tsepoto Bejani. He asks, if reality is a product of consensus, one can conclude that we have agreed and continue to agree to our current state of dispossession and subordination. What are your thoughts on how we continue to support our current state of disempowerment? Did you get the question?
No, definitely. I get the question. I think the way that we do it is by buy-in. So another very interesting thing about Hellenism is how it does ethics. Like if you are a student of literature, I've seen some scholars of literature here, like Dr. Memory is here and a variety of other people. If you're a student, in fact, of the arts, you know, one thing literature teaches you is really the game of ethics, nothing else. And they have an interesting system of corruption, you know, corrupting the soul. You see this in various myths, you know, like the myth of how is really just about how is the soul corrupted. You know, the myth of Lucifer is really also that how the spirit is corrupted by greed and the quest for power. You know, yeah. So, like, the West has an interesting way of you know, like taking the systems of virtue and taking systems of vices and basically manipulating its populace through those systems, you know, manipulating people through that. And it transforms all of these, you know, whether it's systems of vices or systems of virtues into, you know, a large system of vanity. Its entire ethics is built on vanity, you know, and, you know, sort of like pulling people into the system through vanity. And all of us, you know, one way or the other are linked to some kind of vanity, because it's like these systems, these ethics are turned into shiny models, you know, the 7 deadly sins or the 7 vices or whatsoever, you know, whether it's debauchery or power hunger or greed or, you know, sloth or whatsoever. And so, you know, the way that our psyches are built are basically built on that vanity system, you know. Even Freud's main arguments are basically, they touch on that, you know, there's this, you know, this vanity system that's, you know, at the base of it, and then the psyche is modeled upon it. So yeah, I mean, because we're all encapsulated and captives of it, we attach ourselves to the system by sort of constantly buying or consuming one vanity or the next, right? Even the way that they sell objects, that's why capitalism is so interesting. It sort of transforms all of these vanities into commodities for the market, right? That can be circulated in the market. So for us who love reading and stuff, you know, it's not just a character trait, transforms into a vanity, you know, and that vanity is then resold to you through particular objects like books or, you know, technology or whatever, or school knowledge, right? So that's how it keeps us in it. And that's how we also constantly buy into it. And buy in is such a good metaphor because it's actually quite exact. You know, you buy into it, you consume it, you know, you reproduce the vanity cycle, the vanity system. You attach yourself through the vanity. You attach yourself to the system through the vanity system. You know, when I say the system, I mean the system of power and the system of captivity. So I think there's also, maybe we need to also speak more frankly about the larger, you know, vanity system, the vanity paradigm, and how all of us, you know, to one degree or another, are invested, because the older you grow in capitalism, the more invested you become, you know, whether it's through your insurance policies or through your ego. That's another thing. The way you identify, how you cultivate the idea of Aya or the idea of Bababuntu, whatever, you know, the idea of Zandi, Khatebe, you know, how you cultivate that then attaches to your, you know, to how you're locked into the system. Because if I let go of the system, I'm also letting go of the idea of Aya. And that was what Mudibe was saying, that if we need to if we want to really, really let go of colonialism, we need to dismantle the idea of Africa, and we need to invent another idea. You know what I'm saying? So it's these ideas, you know, these vanity points that really
Yes.
keep us bought into the system of reality produced by Western colonialism and Hellenism. So that's another level of investigation that we need to go into in order to think about detachment. And when we detach, we need to transform. So I don't know if we're ready to transform, right? Because if I
Yes.
say I'm an anti-colonialist, I need to transform from the idea of myself as an individual, like
Yes.
collecting all of this knowledge individually, owning all of this knowledge individually, and attach myself to another idea of myself as part of a collective. Therefore, my
Yes.
individual interests need to be dissolved, and the collective interests are primary, and they're the only interests that exist in my ethical and psychological paradigm. So that's how we get out of the reality, is, detaching ourselves from that vanity paradigm.
Very important you mentioned us living in the reality sold to us by the oppressor.
Yeah.
You know, what Seppo is asking is very simple yet very difficult to
Absolutely.
implement. I mean, many of us could very easily just forget about the idea of being in cities and living in bonded houses and driving the cars we pay for, and
Yeah.
because those are the new chains. We're no longer in physical chains. They've invented new chains, and
That's right.
No one is pointing a gun at us anymore. But we bring ourselves now to the prison. We are the prisoner and the warden at the same time, which is the structural violence the other scholar was talking about in the past week. They also use the violence of those that have versus those that are without. It's we're being pitted against each other, the haves and the have-nots. So it's a very simple solution, yet very difficult to implement given the ideas that we have been sold, in our heads by the very person that oppresses us. I love that point. And we've got 5 last minutes, Mwalimu, and there are no other questions. I am going to give you a few minutes to wrap up, and then I will then close.
Yeah. No, thank you so much. I think from the comment, I just want to say with the Mutimbe point, it's not only just detaching ourselves from Africa, it's the idea rather, and inventing a new idea, so the ideas we inherit about, what is Africa? What are we as Africans? Again, this is ideas that have been shaped by the West, and ideas that were constructed by the West as part of their power model, or their power project. I think it's just really the challenge for us is, well, at least from my argument or from my perspective, and as I said, I welcome anyone else to either build on this or to counter this point. But the challenge for us is really just in the realm of ideas. I think those of us who are gifted, to do, theoretical work, to do, ideological work, we mustn't get out of this zone, because worlds and realities are not fixed entities. These are things that have been historically and socially constructed. There's no base of reality that is natural, so to speak. The bases of all social reality are socially invented. And it means that if our enemies have done the invention well, if our ancestors have been able to invent their own models, ancestors that existed out of the colonial, modern and capitalist model, then we too also have the task to begin the work of invention. And we need to take seriously, some of these calls by those who've done before us. We need to begin more like the project of reinventing power, reinventing practice, reinventing ethics, reinventing reality, reinventing even the contents of our imagination. And I do think that it's important that we take more radical stances insofar as how much we can integrate our models with those of the West. Yes, we exist in Western institutions, but I do beckon that we see ourselves as guerrillas within those institutions rather than as, equal partners in those institutions or people who want to participate in those institutions. And, we transform our lives, as Biko says, death must not be the only politicizing thing. Life must also be a politicizing thing. Life must be a model of how to redo almost everything and bring upon a new, system of existence, as Sylvia Winter says, for those generations that are to come, rather than your life merely just being for yourself or merely being for your self-interest or merely being for your upward mobility. Your life must be a suggestion. If we do fail, which we might, by the way, and it's okay to fail. Our ancestors failed, we probably will fail. There's nothing wrong with failure. I think what's more important beyond failure and success is a suggestion or a light for those who are to come, to continue the struggle and for us to rebuild empires and to rebuild our systems of power and systems of reality. That's really, really important.
Yes.
So my last word really is, I think we need to continue our work. We've definitely come very far as Africans. All of us are incredibly important to the struggle. Even if you think that you're not important, you are important. You're a droplet in an ocean that we are recultivating. And I think we need to also be more intentional about the ethos of our institutions, the ideas behind our institutions, the imagination behind our institutions, and the practice, the ethics of how our institutions communicate with one another in order to breed other institutions so that we can recultivate the force of power that is not only good for Africans, but good for all life and all existence on Earth and beyond. That's it.
Yeah, no. A proper way to shut it down, Mwalimu Ayabulela, and I want to thank you for the insightful lecture you delivered tonight. Yeah, you certainly did take me on a journey of many feelings. So yeah, but I choose to remain hopeful on this lovely continent of ours. It's a little scary upfront, but I choose to remain hopeful. And at this point, I would like to thank everyone for hanging out with us tonight. You make these lectures possible. We want to thank all those brought up comments and questions. And also, let me take this moment to invite you to next week's lecture. We have got another powerful one lined up for you next week. Mwalimu Amen Imhotep Pata is bringing a very powerful lecture. It's going to be session number 4. Yes. Our theme this season is philosophy. So yeah, we look forward to Amen Imhotep Pata in the coming week. We also would like to motivate you guys to recruit your friends, family, because this is revolutionary education sessions. You see, the work is about reawakening the African child, the Black child. So bring as many as you can to these sessions. And yeah, sometimes things don't work as planned. So we appreciate everyone's patience. And Ebucosini doesn't really have a full-time staff, so we all volunteer here. So bear with us where we couldn't deliver. We apologize profusely for anything that didn't go as planned. Make it a point to please follow the Black Education Masterclass on Facebook and the Instagram, TikTok, and X. Share with your friends, follow, like, and share with friends as well. For more on Ebucosini Solutions, please visit www.ebucosinisolutions.co.za, and you're also welcome to get in touch with the Black Education Masterclass team at BEM@ebucosinisolutions.co.za. Before I come to close officially, Ma-Africa, in closing from myself, also there's an event lined up for you at Ebukhosini Solution this weekend. Oh no, sorry, in the following weekend, the 25th of August, 12 o'clock. The title there is African Centered Business in a Eurocentric World. And Mwalimu Mabatu Munse will be delivering that lecture for us. The entrance there will be $80, includes light meals and some refreshments. And the pre-booking is essential there. The number for the booking there is 074-690-4012, and you can also do WhatsApp on that line. In closing, Africa, the Africa that is going to win is not the Africa of individuals or characters. It is going to be an Africa of us standing together. And you can do this as persons, as institutions, or countries. It is essential to know that it is not going to be individuals that are going to free us, but us as Africans united as a unit, fighting for the same cause. So with that, I would like to leave you guys tonight, and we give thanks to you, our African family, for the upliftment and liberation of Mama Africa and all her children. And at this point, I'd like everyone to open their mics and, well, if you'd like, and we're going to close it with one popular phrase of ours, Harambe. When all the mics are open, I'm going to count to 3, and we all go Harambe in shutting down. Are we all in the
Rambe!
Mwalimu Ayabulela, thanks very much for this evening. Africa, thank you for being with us tonight. Enjoy your evening. See you in the coming week.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Enjoy your evenings.
I see.
Thank you, everyone.